Hello and welcome to Aspenwaite Media, and specifically this is the Aspenwaite History Series, and today we're on part 5 of our exciting series on the birth of the English nation. And as always, I'm joined by the strongest Viking in the world now, who goes under the name of Callum Waite. And how are we today, Callum?
I'm good, thanks, chap. How are you?
And how is the baby Evelyn?
Yeah, she's fine. She's giggling upstairs.
Is she engaged in runic activity?
Oh, all sorts of activity, yeah.
Very,
Me,
very good.
dark art. Yeah.
Dark art. Anyway, so today we're talking about King Æthelstan, who I think it's actually quite surprising, which we might talk about later, Callum, why Æthelstan didn't manage to get the Great labelled with him. So I think you could, in the same way that we tried to look at Æthelflæd and put her place in history into context. I think you could make a case for saying Æthelstan was arguably the most successful king of any English king in history. I don't think that is a preposterous thing to say. So this is a very great man. He was born in 894, and he was the eldest son of his father, Edward the Elder, who we also talked about extensively on the show about Æthelflæd, who was Edward the Elder's sister. And Callum told us last week about how Æthelstan himself was almost certainly brought up in Mercia by anti-Æthelflæd. Now that's probably because Æthelstan's mother was a lady called, I hope I get spelt this right, is probably Echgwin actually, or it could be Ecgwin. One of the problems, as we discussed in previous episodes of this particular time in history, is there are not obviously extensive records, and so some of the things which are noted are not necessarily conclusively true. They are what people think is probably likely. So it seems to be the consensus of opinion that Æthelstan's mother was of low rank. In the Last Kingdom, she is shown as being of very low rank, and in fact, Edward the Elder marries a second time, and effectively Æthelstan is regarded as illegitimate, effectively, and there is some evidence that that's how he was seen during his lifetime, which may well have led to some of the issues that arose on his father's death. So he was the oldest son of his father by the first wife. There went on to be 3 wives, but unlike the portrayal in The Last Kingdom, Ecgwin herself was not displaced, and she actually died at a fairly early age. But obviously this wasn't necessarily very good for Æthelstan. So Æthelstan grew up, as we say, looked after by Æthelflæd, not under the direct care of his own father, and to some extent would have been considered by the new. In fact, they weren't queens. They didn't have queens, did they? The Saxons, which is very interesting, as you observed last week. So the new wife of Edward the Elder would have considered Æthelstan to have been a threat to her own children, who were, I think, Elfwerd and Edwin. Both of which I'm really looking forward to talking to you about that, Callum, about what happened to them. So anyway, Callum was very keen to get me moving on until the year 924, and Callum will tell us what happened in 924, Callum.
Right, so, yeah, we picked up from where we ended last week. So King Edward the Elder died at Farndon in northern Mercia on the 17th of July, 924. And the ensuing events are a little bit unclear. Elfweard was Edward's oldest son by Æthelflæd, and had ranked above Æthelstan in the Wessex court. We don't know this for sure, but we can sort of guess that Edward's plan was maybe to have Elfweard be the successor of King in Wessex, and then Æthelstan to take over as King of Mercia. We can tell this for several reasons. Obviously, we talked last week about how Æthelflaed's daughter was taken out of Mercia to basically be put in a monastery, whereas that planted Æthelstan in place to become king of Mercia. So we think that was probably Edward's plan. And obviously, this didn't quite go how he wanted, because very shortly after Edward died himself, I think it was only 13 days, in fact, 13 to 18 days later, his oldest son died as well. So this obviously left Wessex without a king.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to come in on that. Thank you for allowing me to do so, Mr. Learned Man. So just to be clear on this, beyond all doubt, Æthelstan was king of Mercia in 924, so there was no problem with him succeeding to become the king of the Mercians. That definitely happened. It is then generally considered that there was a period before he was able to exert his control over Wessex itself. And I'm quite interested to hear whether you think Æthelstan may have had a part to play in the death of his younger brother.
It's funny, actually. I've never thought about that possibility before. I don't think that is the case, from what we know of his character.
Well, I would probably have to disagree with you there, but especially when we come on to talk about Edwin, of course, which is a very interesting part of today's show, I think. I mean, I think one of the things which is very frustrating about studying Anglo-Saxons, and is true of most of, so as we discussed, it's true of Æthelflaed herself, and actually true of Æthelstan, as we'll come on to later. They seem to be sort of running around fighting in battles, and then all of a sudden they die. Within a year or so. And I try really hard to find out whether they died because they drank too much, or they had measles, or someone chopped their heads off or something, and it just said they died, and you can't find out why they died. Elfweird, I think I did read something. I did read something when I was doing my research for today's show. I think there is a school of opinion that he was involved in Elfweird's death. It just seems incredibly convenient that his younger brother, who, as you say, actually though was lined up for the top job over him because of the way the marriages went, that Elfweird should could die within 3 weeks of Edward the Elder's death. I just would have to be quite suspicious, I think.
Yeah, sure. I think the caveat to that is that there doesn't seem to have been any resistance at all actually against Æthelstan at the time of his death. He certainly wasn't welcomed as a king after Æthelweird died or anything like that. But we've got charters and stuff from that time which show that he was sort of present at the time, in front of bishops of Wessex and stuff like that. And I think that if it was suspected that he had killed the king of Wessex, maybe there would be more backlash against him, and maybe Edwin himself would have been quicker to raise an army against Æthelstan, maybe even. Whereas there's no evidence of that.
Yes, that's the next obvious question for you, good sir. So why didn't Edwin become the king upon his brother dying?
Yeah, this is one of the mysterious things, like you mentioned, going on about, you read, there are some quite grandiose statements in different texts of the time, and they sort of just wash over what you would think is in very important details. The truth of the matter is we don't really know why Edwin didn't become king at the time. You could very much argue that maybe he tried to, and he was just unsuccessful in doing so. Either way, what we know is at first, after Æthelweird died, there was a small portion of time where Wessex went without a king. Æthelstan was present in Wessex, but he was very much treated as the king of Mercia, not as the king of Wessex and Mercia. We don't really know a whole lot of what Edwin was doing at the time. All we know is that in 933 he drowned in a shipwreck in the North Sea.
Right.
That's pretty much all we sort of know about him, really. We don't really know much more than that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that in a bit more detail, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
So, according to my research, as I say, Æthelstan became king of Mercia almost instantaneously upon his father's death, but it actually wasn't until 925 in the next year that he was actually crowned king of Wessex. And that was rather interestingly done at Kingston upon Thames, which I think was chosen because it was sort of the bridge between Mercia and Wessex. It was sort of somewhere that sort of united the two nations. So he was crowned there.
A diplomatic decision. Yeah.
Anything else to add about the coronation?
So he certainly wasn't welcomed in Wessex. His coronation wasn't welcomed at all. And there's even accounts of a nobleman called Alfred. We don't know much about him, but apparently he even had a plot to physically blind Æthelstan, because blinding would have been a sufficient disability to render Æthelstan ineligible for kingship in Wessex. So we know that there was an attempt to maim him, to make him ineligible to become king of Wessex. Obviously, this must have been thwarted. There isn't any account of whether Alfred was killed or what happened. All we know, obviously, that Æthelstan wasn't blinded, and this wasn't successful. So filling the bridge between Edwin dying, we do know that tensions between Æthelstan and Winchester continued for some years before even Edwin's death. In fact, the Bishop of Winchester didn't even attend the coronation of Æthelstan or witness any of his known charters right up until 928.
It rather makes you wonder. So, how did he manage to? Who was powerful enough to actually get him over the line, so to speak?
I think we can certainly guess at a couple of things, make some educated guesses. I think we have to remember that he was brought up by Æthelflaed, who was extremely charming and extremely intelligent, notoriously good at sort of like wooing people, as it were. I think you can tell certainly from later on accounts, but he would have been like it all his life. Æthelstan was just like his auntie in this respect. He also, unlike his grandfather, didn't have any physical ailments, Alfred the Great. So I imagine he would have been quite a force to be reckoned with. Very intelligent man, probably a very, very physically fit man. We know that he was already a successful war leader. Æthelflaed groomed him to be a good warrior, and he actually led several campaigns into Northumbria while he was serving under her in the Mercian court. So he would have been battle-hardened, extremely intelligent, probably extremely politically savvy, very cerebral, very charming man. It's quite a dangerous combination for anybody that has any chinks in their armour,
Yes, well, that's something we'll come on to. So I think the next thing I wanted to talk about was when I didn't know this before I was researching for today's show. So Æthelstan never got married. Do you have any views on why that was so?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two schools of thought with that. There is one school of thought is that Wessex wouldn't accept him as king unless he took a pledge of, piety and celibacy. So that was the only way that he could become king of Wessex. Obviously, so his bloodline wouldn't endure. The other one is that we know he was an extremely religious man, just like his grandfather, King Alfred the Great. Extremely religious. Everything he did in his life was pretty much centered around Christianity and his love for God. So the other school of thought is that he was religiously motivated and sort of determined to live a life of chastity, and took it very, very seriously, which to me and you might sound a little bit silly, but in those days, I suppose he took it as something that, as a pride, as something to do with pride.
Well, of course, again, because of the lack of evidence, we don't know whether he had 73 million concubines, or even
I'm sure.
whether he was you know not
If,
necessarily
if,
attracted to women. I mean,
if he died a virgin, then that's quite a feat for a man that was as powerful as him. For a man that was by all accounts was a good-looking man. He was the most powerful man in Britain.
what a fascinating conversation to be having on our History Channel.
Yeah, who knows? He might have had 1,000 bastards like Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones. We don't know.
Interesting. So we next have. So maybe you and I are going to have a difference of opinion over this. So we have the death of Edwin, which is, I think, by the standards of 2020. I was thinking about this, about the attitudes towards the statues in Bristol and London, and how people today are judging people like Edward Colston, who, yes, he was involved in the slave trade, but was also an enormous philanthropist for Bristol, and so people are very much judging people who were considered to be great at the time by the standards of today. And I think I was very mindful of this when I was reflecting upon Edwin's death. So effectively, my understanding is that Æthelstan was threatened by Edwin, and there seems to have been some sort of trouble. So whether Edwin was openly mutinying against him or lobbying to be king or something, and rather interestingly, and again, I think there's a parallel in one of the more interesting period documentaries, not documentaries, but period dramas of this time, where Edwin is basically put onto a leaky, the literature says a leaking boat. So I'm not quite sure what that means, the leaking boat, but he's put on a boat that isn't particularly seaworthy, presumably in the expectation this boat is not going to last very long, and therefore the boat will sail out, and then he will die out of the gaze of the public eye, so to speak, and Æthelstan can sort of deny all knowledge of what's happened. From what I understand happened is Edwin himself chose, rather than wait for the inevitable, he actually dived into the sea and effectively drowned of his own volition. That's
Wow.
and so my reading is that obviously legend has it, or folklore probably rather than legend, is that Æthelstan, suddenly having got rid of his opponent, saw the light and was very troubled by what he had done, and I think he built some sort of shrine or building in Edwin's honour, which might have been in Dorset, if I remember rightly from my history. And again, though, it really makes me wonder, going back to the other brother, if Æthelstan was capable of such intrigue, maybe this wasn't the first time he did it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and we've actually sort of got a little murder mystery on our hands here, haven't we? You could even say. But as I said, it's all quite ambiguous. But we know that the 12th century chronicler Simeon of Durham, who was one of the Normans' most well-known historians, said that Æthelstan ordered Edwin to be drowned. But a lot of historians disagree with this, and as you said at the beginning of the show, especially around sort of the Norman medieval period, a lot of historians just sort of filled in the blanks with whatever they thought was the most exciting story. So we don't know if this is true or not. And another school of thought is that Edwin might have fled England after an unsuccessful rebellion against Æthelstan's rule. But either way, his death helped put an end to Winchester's opposition. I think the place where Edwin was sent for burial was, I actually don't know where this is, so I'm sure you can help me out. It's the Abbey of St. Bertin in St. Omer. Do you know where that is?
No.
I assume that it may not even be in England. Maybe it's somewhere in Francia. I don't know.
How do you spell Omer?
Omer. Maybe
No.
somewhere in northern France. But very interesting nonetheless. But as you said, after he died, Æthelstan sent alms to the abbey for his dead brother and received monks to Wessex from the abbey, and graciously gave them lots of money and gifts to take back with them to fund.
It's very good
the
of him,
church.
isn't it?
Yeah. So very, very, like what we were saying though about being cerebral, very, very good politically. Because I mean, talk about sweet talking the people that might actually have been coming to sort of chastise you, and they sent him home. He sent them home, basically going, "Oh, Æthelstan is such a great chap,"
I mean, what's there's something I meant to say earlier. Actually, we were talking last week about whether we thought that Mercia was a vassal kingdom of Wessex or not, and I guess there's so many conflicting facts here. If Mercia was a vassal kingdom of Wessex, then it rather begs the question why Aelfweard wasn't made king of both kingdoms like his father was. But maybe, as you say, maybe that was the plan of his father. Maybe his father thought that was how he wanted it to go. But it doesn't seem, on the basis of what we know, a recipe for success that Aelfweard and Æthelstan would have been capable of successfully integrating together, shall we say?
Yeah, I actually have a theory about this, and it is just a theory. But there are accounts that Alfred the Great showered Æthelstan in gifts when Æthelstan was a young boy, and actually treated him probably better than Alfred ever treated Edward the Elder, which is quite interesting. So Alfred seemed to see greatness in Æthelstan, even when he was not much more than a toddler.
Which is very
which is very intriguing. You could maybe surmise that Edward was potentially even jealous of Æthelstan. That's why he didn't want him to become as mighty as a ruler as Edward was. Either that, or the only other conclusion I can think of is that Edward didn't think that any of his sons were great enough to have the responsibility of being king of as much territory as he was. I don't think this is the case. I think that Æthelstan would have probably quite clearly been capable, and I think that it would have actually probably worked in Æthelstan's favour to have been brought up under Æthelflaed, who, as we discussed last week, was probably pound for pound greater than Edward was.
So I think the next next noteworthy event of Æthelstan's life would be conquering York in 927. So what can you tell us about that?
Right, yeah. So in January 926, Æthelstan arranged for one of his sisters to marry King Sitric of York, who was the Viking ruler of York. The two kings basically agreed not to invade each other's territories or support each other's enemies while they lived. But only a year after this, Sitric died. Maybe this comes back into our murder mysteries. Maybe Æthelstan had him assassinated, because this is all very convenient for Æthelstan. But the following year, Sitric died, and Æthelstan seized the chance to invade. Guthfrith was a Viking king of Dublin and Sitric's cousin, and he led a fleet from Dublin to try and take the throne. But Æthelstan won a massive battle and prevailed, capturing York, and received the submission of the Danish people in York.
Yeah, obviously this was incredibly significant, because it basically meant at that point that Æthelstan was now the first person in history to be effectively the overlord of all of England.
Yeah, massively, a defining moment in British history, and it's sort of what I think is quite nice is, I mean, we can only guess at this, but I assume that Æthelstan and Æthelflaed had a very close relationship, and he was probably obviously a lot closer to Æthelflaed than he was to his father. And what's nice is we touched on how Æthelflaed actually won through battle and negotiation the allegiance of the King of York but died before they could sign the treaty. So Æthelstan sort of picked up where she left off and managed to succeed where she ever so slightly fell short, which is quite a nice, from a sentimental point of view. Massive point in Britain's history.
Yes, so this then meant that officially in the history books from 927 until Æthelstan's death, he is officially recorded as King of all England, and all the coins were struck accordingly. So this was an amazing achievement. So you consider that Æthelstan ascended the throne of Mercia in 924, was by no means accepted by the Wessex people, and yet within 3 years he actually did something that his father and his grandfather had been unable to do. And one thing which I think is incredibly noteworthy is, as far as I'm aware, he had a 100% success rate in battles over his lifetime. So he didn't lose a single battle, which is when you consider, I think you were telling us last week. I think, maybe in Alfred's week, that there was something like 11 battles in 877, of which the Vikings only won 2. The Saxons only won 2 out of 11. So for Æthelstan to actually go through his lifetime undefeated is really quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's amazing, and also I think we need to put into perspective. It's not like the Vikings around this time got weaker. We know that like Francia and all these other places in Europe were still living in fear of the Vikings and were still being pillaged regularly. What we see in England through what started with Alfred's sort of his burrs and his reconcentration on militarization is, by this point in history, Anglo-Saxon Britain was the cream of the crop in all of Europe. They were the top intellectually, militaristically. As I said, in Æthelstan's lifetime, as you said, it didn't lose a single battle, and these were against great warriors. These weren't just some rabble that he was fighting. I mean, it's quite awe-inspiring. The more you look into it, the more impressive you realise it is. And it's, as I said, it's the governing tactics and the diplomacy and all of these things that go into it as well. So we know that when he did take York, he had the support of all the Welsh kings. There were 4 Welsh kingdoms at the time, as you mentioned last episode. He had all of them, all of their armies, as well as obviously the kingdoms of East Anglia, which were actually mainly Danes in terms of their blood anyway. Danes and Mercia and Wessex. So he'd had a massive army coming up with him. And they're all loyal to him. Yeah,
I think we touched on this last week. We started to see in Edward the Elder's reign conflict between the Danish Vikings and the Norwegian Vikings, which probably was very helpful to Æthelstan.
Yeah, sure.
So before we move on to the other sort of amazing military achievements of Æthelstan's reign, he also received a lot of plaudits for his achievements in administration and the centralisation of government. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, it's really a massively defining point in British history. So what we saw in, say, Alfred the Great's day was, you would have, say, a king of Wessex, and then they would have ealdormen. And essentially what an ealdorman was, he was the leader of a county. So they would oversee a county for him, so there'd be like the ealdorman of Devon, of Somerset, blah, blah, blah. And they didn't have like a fixed place of parliament like we have today. What would happen is the king would call a witan, which is basically like calling a royal council. He would call the witan, and wherever the king called the witan, all of his ealdormen would have to meet there. They govern, they talk about what was going to happen, and they'd set to work. Now, what happened in Æthelstan's time is it goes far beyond that, because we start seeing, governing on such a grand scale. You can't have a room full of 8 men having a chat over a cup of mead, talking about what you're going to do next. He was governing such a massive region that it would have seemed very much like Parliament does today. you would have had bishops from all over the country, thanes from all over the country, aldermen, kings, or sub-kings, I think they were called, all the kings of Wales and their noblemen, all of the leaders of Strathclyde, Scotland, all of these people would have been there. So there would have been hundreds of people in his court. So it would have been very, very different from, his grandfather's time. So we see a massive difference and a massive sort of upscaling of administration during Æthelstan's time. And actually, some historians say that although this obviously wouldn't have been his goal, it was actually the first time we see a government like we see in Britain today.
Yeah, and of course, without going too far into the future, one of the reasons that the Normans found it so easy to conquer England was in fact the superb local government and administration of the kingdom, which was basically quite easy for someone just to slot into and replicate.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because with a centralised government, you need to have a centralised government to get out of that province-style rulership, with different kings in different provinces. You need a centralised government, but at the same time, obviously, you are more vulnerable in terms of if you just come over and you completely conquer that, then you are left far more vulnerable.
Yeah, so before we get on to the next exciting bit, any other little facts about sort of Æthelstan's reign before we get on to the Scottish things?
Yeah, just a couple of little things actually. So after he conquered York, it led to 7 years of peace in the north, which I think was the longest amount of time there had gone without a single battle in the whole of Britain since like the Roman times. I think something crazy like that, which is 7 whole years of peace. Might not sound a lot in these days, but in those days it would have been quite a massive accomplishment. Also want to talk about in his time his reforms in terms of law. So he was very big on trying to make the place very civilized. He was a massive fan of Charlemagne, and a lot of people actually in Francia compared him to Charlemagne, even in his lifetime, which is a massive, obviously, compliment to Æthelstan. But he was the first person to bring in essentially police forces. So he thought that theft and things like that was disgusting. Theft was like the basis of being uncivilized. So he brought in basically what was like a modern police force, and all this would mean is that there was a group of appointed sort of 10 to 12 men that would sort of walk around every single sort of settlement, and they would make sure basically that everyone was behaving themselves, that nobody was stealing and assaulting anybody in any way. I actually think this is quite a cool thing to read, because in one of the scriptures that we got about our own family name, so just being a bit indulgent a minute, our surname for everyone listening is Waite. W-O-T. So they were essentially like an early form of police force, and late at night when everyone else was asleep, they would have wandered around with their torches and basically just made sure that everything was kept in order. So I thought it was quite interesting reading that. I
think they were singing Christmas carols, personally.
If they were anything like you, they were most definitely probably singing very loudly and keeping everyone awake.
After drinking a lot of mead. Yeah,
definitely, obviously.
So I think you may correct me over this. We then go to 934 with a very successful invasion of Scotland. But I think that what led to that was that the Scottish King Constantine, or Tyne II, actually invaded England with some Viking allies. Is that right?
Yeah, this is quite an ambiguous thing, like many things we're talking about here. What we know is that in 934, Ealdred of Bamber died. So he was basically like one of the key rulers of the north. He was one of the people that when Æthelstan conquered York, there was a big meeting. The King of Strathclyde, the King of Scotland, Eldred of Bamber, they all met. Which is Bamber is the same place from the Last Kingdom that's called Bebbanburg. So Uhtred of Bebbanburg, Eldred of Bamber would have been his relative. If Uhtred was real, that is.
He was real.
But yeah, so Eldred of Bamber died, and what there seems to have been is a dispute over who had the land. So King Constantine thought that he should take over the land, and Æthelstan said, no, sod off. I'm having this. I'm the big daddy at the end of the day. I'm overlord of Britain. You're just King of Scotland. So we think that's what led to the battle.
So make sure we don't get ahead of ourselves here. We're still in 934, Callum. So this is this is the invasion of Scotland and defeating the Scots. And I think Constantine II basically swore allegiance or whatever it was to Æthelstan. Certainly for the time being, anyway.
Oh, interesting. Well, so you think that? Sorry, did you just say that Constantine had allegiance to Æthelstan in 934?
Yeah, because Æthelstan invaded Scotland and subjugated the Scots, and one of the outcomes of that was Constantine recognising Æthelstan's sort of superiority over him. But it was.
Oh yeah, no. Sure. My only point is that he already had recognised his superiority after he became King of York and King of Northumbria, but then obviously Constantine and Æthelstan had that debate over Bamber in 934 when Eldred died, and we think this is what led to the invasion of Scotland. So they did make up again afterwards, but they think that's why they had the battle.
So then we move on 3 years to 937, and we have this massive invasion of England by the Scots and the Vikings and various other people on their side. So there were, I think I read somewhere, 5 to 7 different nationalities all on the side of Constantine's army or whatever the Viking Dublin leader was that we mentioned earlier that ended in Frith. So they basically ran amok through the north of England, and I think it's true to say that Æthelstan gathered the largest army ever seen in the British Isles up to that point. Is that right?
Yeah, so this battle would have been the biggest battle that anybody would have seen since the days of the Romans. Olaf Guthrufsson, who was the son of Guthrum, who we were talking about earlier, who Æthelstan defeated to become King of Northumbria, his son Olaf was the Norse king of Dublin. And he made an alliance with the Norse and the Scots, and he cemented the Scottish alliance with the Norse by marrying Constantine's daughter, King Constantine of Scotland's daughter. So he married her. Olaf defeated all of his rivals in sort of the Viking world to become king of all the Viking armies. So sort of a massive force. Olaf and Constantine knew that individually they could not stand up to Æthelstan, but they knew that if they combined their forces, they'd have a pretty good chance. There would have been a massive, massive army behind them. As I said, pretty much the whole Viking world and all of Scotland would have been behind them. And in autumn, they managed to convince the leaders of Strathclyde, the Strathclyde Britons, under King Owain, also to invade England.
So we then have arguably, probably one of the 3 biggest battles in English history, or even British history, and certainly, in my opinion, the first battle on British soil that involved multiple nations and indeed people from outside the British Isles, which was Brunanburh. I don't know how you would pronounce it, but Brunanburh. So this was quite a staggering battle with many thousands on each side, wasn't it?
Yeah, really. We don't know the exact numbers, but we know, as I said, it would have been the biggest army on either side seen since Roman occupation of Britain, since the Roman legions were there. And what's quite interesting to note is this says quite a lot about Æthelstan's character. Some historians almost criticize him for saying that he took a sort of sluggish, sort of leisurely sort of response to this invasion force. And it's really quite interesting. So rather than freaking out and being like, oh, we got to call the banners, we got to get all the ealdormen, raise all the armies, we need to fight right now. He actually just sort of sat back, basically sipped his wine and thought, okay, I'm going to let this play out a little bit. I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to let these sort of idiots tire themselves out a little bit, thinking that they're going to rustle my feathers. And apparently he sat around for quite some time, not taking any action. It's quite interesting. There's two ways you can look at this. You can either criticize him, or you can realize actually what an intelligent and probably cerebral man he was. He sat back and he spent weeks planning what was the best course of action. And it's quite interesting. He's compared in this sense to Harold Hardrada of 1066, and he was saying if Harold had done what Æthelstan had done, then he might have won the Battle of Hastings, because obviously what Harold did was march down, battle worn already, half an army, and made.
You mean Harold Godwinson? You mean?
Sorry, Harold Godwinson. Harold Hardrada was the king of the Norse army.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. Harold Godwinson obviously took a very rash approach and ended up getting himself slaughtered. What Æthelstan did the exact opposite of this. He sat back, he gathered his forces nice and slowly. He made sure that every single soldier he could possibly have under his command was assembled, well-fed, nice and fat, happy, seen to by the concubines, finest armor and weapons in the land, and they were ready for battle. So by the time that the two sides did meet at the Battle of Bannockburn, this resulted in an absolutely overwhelming victory for Æthelstan. We know that his young half brother, the future king Edmund I of England, was there with him, who did great at the battle. Olaf managed to escape back to Dublin with a remnant of his forces, but really this would have been not very many people. He was absolutely, utterly crushed. Constantine lost his son at the battle, so this would have been absolutely crushing for King Constantine of Scotland. The English did, of course, suffer heavy losses, as is natural in such a massive battle, including two of Æthelstan's cousins, sons of Edward the Elder's younger brother, Ethelweard. So we weren't without losses, but an overwhelming victory for Æthelstan.
Yeah, just to put this into context, 5 kings and 7 earls lost their lives at that battle, which is quite staggering, isn't it?
Cool, absolutely staggering. I mean, talk about a grand battle. Absolutely amazing. It's like something from a movie.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? How in history, it's one thing we'll never know. Why it is that, for instance, you and I were both taught about Alfred burning the cakes, and there's a lot of reverence of Alfred as a person, allowing him to be voted the 14th greatest Englishman of all time, and yet Brunanburh, which was probably certainly from the point of view of an English person and the English nation, it was significant in many respects. It was significant politically, culturally, militarily. It was, as you, I suspect, actually, you say about the Romans. I mean, I would have thought that short of the Romans facing the Iceni, when I think Boudicca had something like 10,000 troops under her command, fighting something like 2,000 or 3,000 Romans. I think it's that sort of numbers. This would have been bigger than that, and on a scale that had never been seen. A lot of the quite decisive battles fought earlier would have probably only had 1,000 people on the battlefield. Whereas this would have had many thousands of people. For those who are interested, there's some very good documentaries on Brunanburh on YouTube, which make for fascinating viewing. So Yeah, so old Æthelstan triumphs at Brunanburh, and it's very sad. So in a way, you could say that as the song says, the history book on the shelf is always repeating itself. So just like his wonderful auntie, who at the peak of her powers, having just subjugated most of the northern lords, died very shortly afterwards. This is what happened to Æthelstan. So Æthelstan reaches a career high point in 937, and at this point, it probably would be true to say, you could almost say he was king of Britain.
Yeah, yeah. So that's definitely what he was seen as. We know that all of Francia at the time, modern-day France, were completely in awe of Æthelstan, and there are historical records from that time. They were very literate people, the Franks, and there are lots of historical accounts from all over Francia and modern-day and Saxony, modern-day Germany, but Saxony at the time. And they refer to him as Overlord of Britain. And as I said, they refer to him as Overlord of Britain, and they compare him to Charlemagne. There are some texts even in Francia and Saxony that describe him as an emperor, and describe him as the greatest Christian in the world, I think, at his time, this is an amazing praise. We also know that he was seen so highly of by the people of Francia and Saxony that they showered him in gifts. I read something absolutely amazing, and it was one of the Frankish kings thought so highly of Æthelstan that he sought him out, and he gave him the sword of Charlemagne, and a crown made of pure gold, and one of the purported thorns from Jesus Christ's crown of thorns, which obviously in Christian society would have been valuable beyond description.
So, what do we know about him dying then, Callum? Have you any evidence as to why he died? Because there he is, as I say, he's 43 years old. Clearly very active, because there's no reason to believe he didn't fight himself at Brunanburh.
Yep.
And yet, within 2 years of that, he's dead.
Yeah.
Any idea why?
Yeah, so it's funny, isn't it? I mean, these time and time again in these different annals and stuff, there's no mention of why they die. We have a lot to thank William of Malmesbury for. So William of Malmesbury, we brought him up in every single episode we've talked about. He was probably the Normans' most famous historian, and we have a lot to thank him for. With probably half of the knowledge we have is from William of Malmesbury, who gathered all of the texts from all over Britain, before they would have been burnt or destroyed, and he made, compiled texts all made out of, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, lots of other sources, including scrolls and sources from Francia and Saxony, all over the Western world. So we have a lot to thank him for. But yeah, as you said, no mention of why he died. All we know is that he died at Gloucester on the 27th of October, 939. A bit like Æthelflaed, talking about Æthelflaed last episode. This man fought a lot of battles in his life. I expect by this time in his life, he was quite battle worn. I would be, surprised if he didn't have some pretty nasty injuries. Yeah, in those days, you could die of infection. It could have been infection, could have been any number of things. We talked about life expectancy in one of the first episodes of this. By this point, he was, for those times, a fairly decent age. I mean, he was about 45 years old, which, only 15 years older than I am. But yeah, for such a glorious life, he did so much in his life. I suppose, without sounding cheesy, it's like, the brightest flames burn out quickest, don't they?
Yes, it's be very interesting to have seen what would have happened if he'd lived another 10 years, for instance. What impact that would have had. But going back to last week, so Edward the Elder had 14 children. I think two children by the first wife, Egwin, and then 3, I think, by the middle wife, and then a whole shed load more by the last one. And it's interesting because all of the no, in fact, I think thinking about it, there were 5. I think there were 5 children of the second wife. And what actually happened is Æthelstan was succeeded by Edmund Ironside, wasn't he?
Yes.
Who was the eldest son of the third wife, with all of the children of the second wife predeceasing Edmund.
Yeah.
So Edmund himself was quite formidable. He would have been very active at Brunanburh, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yep, we touched on that. Æthelstan deliberately would have taken him with him on all of these campaigns. He was grooming him, knowing that he would have been king after his death.
Yeah. So what a wonderful label to be given, Ironside. Isn't that quite something? Isn't it?
Definitely appeals to the man in you, doesn't it?
Are you looking at me when you're saying that, or?
It's a manly name. That's what I'm getting at. It's a manly name.
Hello, my name is Ironside. I think he used to be a detective, but that's got no place in a series on the birth of the nation. So yeah, so I think we've done justice to Æthelstan. So this is a man who incredibly influential in English history. I suppose also British history. Again, just Callum was talking about our family name. One of the other things which I'd like to note is one of the Welsh kings that Callum referred to, one of the 4 kings, was a king called Hywel Dda, who is Callum, my 35 times great grandfather. So in effect, we were there. If you know, we were.
Certainly in our bloodline, and considering that you are predominantly have Norse blood running through your veins, as do I, you might have even had a little bit of Olaf in you as well. Who knows?
Yeah, I know. Obviously, again, so, without being too sort of whatever the word is about families. So your mother, my wife, is directly related to Citric, for instance.
Yeah.
So from your point of view, obviously, you know, there's a massive real connection with this period, and many of the characters that were active at this time, you know, are in your bloodlines. That's really quite amazing. So
the big old dispute.
So Æthelstan, first king of the English. It's quite interesting that within 70 years of this, we have a Danish king, but that's for another episode. So thank you very much for your contribution today, Callum. That was, I think, a very slick performance with your usual insight.
Do you mind if I just add something? Just one more thing.
You can add whatever you like.
Thank you. I just thought it'd be a nice little way to round up. Talking about where he chose to be buried. So.
Oh yes, I meant to talk about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So Æthelstan decided that he wanted to be buried at Malmesbury Abbey, where he had buried his cousins who died at Barenberg. What's quite interesting to note is that no other member of the West Saxon royal family was buried there. And according to William of Malmesbury, Æthelstan's choice reflected his devotion both to the abbey, and also he never forgot that Wessex opposed his rule so much early on, and he didn't want to honour Wessex by being buried at Winchester, where all the Wessex kings traditionally were. So instead, he was buried at Malmesbury, which is in Somerset, isn't it?
It's actually in Wiltshire, I think.
Was it?
No, the reason I meant to mention it was we actually went for a trip to Malmesbury, Lisa Waite and I. I'm not sure how long ago, 3 years, 4 years. And I didn't know at the time that Æthelstan was buried in Malmesbury. And we always like to look at churches and, abbeys and whatever. So we went into, and I obviously, as a historian, I came across Æthelstan's tomb, which was, so I actually have been there, thing of great note to me. It's quite extraordinary, really, that to think that somebody of that significance was almost like casually buried in this place and nobody knows he's there, sort of thing. So yeah, no, it made a big impression on me. I remember it being quite a big event. So yeah, Malmesbury. For those of you who don't know, so Malmesbury is quite easily accessible off the M4. So quite a lovely, charming little town with nice features. So anyway, so that's the end of Æthelstan. Next week we're moving on to. We've only got 3 shows left, obviously culminating in Battle of Hastings itself. So next week we're going to take you through the reign of Edmund Ironside and start to see the emerging influence of Sven Forkbeard in particular. So thank you to Callum. Thank you all for watching. Keep the comments going. And we've enjoyed doing today's show, and take care. Bye.